Peace and blessings, family. This is your brother, asarimhotep, with the Madhu Andela Institute for the Advancement of Science and Culture. Today, we have a most magnificent interview with Professor Hunter Adams. We're going to be talking about Africa, science, and maybe we'll get into a little bit of the Dogon. That and more when we return. Indeed, we are back. I want to thank everyone who is checking out this archive, and just a few announcements. And we'll start off with the upcoming interview with Dr. Lima Mukinge, who is a elder of the Baluba people. And professor of, Baluba culture, religion, and philosophy. He has a couple of texts that will be coming out this year, and we will discuss those, as well as the Chiluba language and the whole entire kingship and its influence in the Democratic Republic of Congo and beyond. And we'll probably touch on some correspondences between the Baluba culture and that of ancient Egypt. And speaking of that, we have done a soft launch for the Cheikh Anta film. And for those who want to support the initial fundraising efforts, please visit patreon.com/asarimhotep. This is a documentary film, an upcoming documentary film, where we will be comparing and demonstrating the live and dynamic interactions and cultural correspondences between ancient Kemet and the Bantu cultures of Central, East, and Southern Africa. And so it's going to be a very profound documentary. And so, if you want to be a part of this historic documentation, again, visit patreon.com/asarimhotep. And, learn more about the upcoming film. And the website for Cheikh Anta will be released sometime next week, which will be the first week in in October, which is also Black Science Month, for those that didn't know. And so we look forward to, informing you more of the details and the progress of the film as the months and things progress. So with that said, without further ado, I bring on our esteemed guest, Professor Hunter Adams. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing marvelous.
Excellent. I'm very honored and appreciative that you have taken time out of your busy day to converse with me and my audience about a wide variety of topics, and especially dealing with the sciences and African people and all of that. So again, I'm eternally grateful, for you sharing your time and wisdom with us today. And so for those who may not be familiar with you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and how you got interested in the various things that you are interested in education and things of that nature.
Yes, thank you for this invitation. I truly appreciate you, and I've been a follower of your work for some time, and I really appreciate your efforts in trying to show, as Diop said, Cheikh Anta Diop said, the cultural unity of African people via language and via science and via a lot of other things. So I'm a Chicago, Illinois native. Um, I had two wonderful parents, Mama Lorraine Adams and Hunter Adams Jr. I'm Hunter Adams III. And they encouraged me to be independent, to think for myself. And that's kind of how I've been. But most importantly for me, they encouraged my curiosity. And growing up, they bought me science sets, chemistry sets, physics sets, and so forth. And I've always had an interest from there on in wondering how the world works. Why, for example, something most everyone considers is, why is the sky black at night? That's still a profound question. The blackness, as you know, we will maybe get into, is so profound, but we live in a culture that denigrates and so forth. They can't deal with the mystery of blackness, as the great musician composer Sun Ra said. And so my interest in science took me to a Department of Energy National Laboratory, a particle accelerator outside of Chicago. And I worked there for a number of years in high energy physics. I'm not trained as a physicist. I don't have a PhD in physics, but nonetheless, I do have a Bachelor of Science degree from Chicago State University. I did graduate studies in neuroscience at University College of London. I did studies of ethics at University College of London, also Imperial College. So I have a broad background, studied with political science and history and African culture with Dr. Jetty J. Carruthers, Dr. Anderson Thompson, Dr. Harold Pates, studied psychology and how the mind works and the politics of psychology, sociology of psychology with Dr. Bobby Wright. I worked with Dr. Asa Hilliard with the Portland, Oregon. I know they've been in a lot of news lately of protesting. Well, that type of protesting goes back to the 1980s when Robert Hurd organized the Black United Front to confront the education that Black children were receiving in Portland. And the Black community there eventually filed a lawsuit to decolonize and desegregate the curriculum. And I think it was 1982, the Board of Education hired Dr. Asa Hilliard to come up with a plan on how to desegregate the curriculum, to decolonize the curriculum. Because anyone growing up in the 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, and beyond, if you have viewers who are older than that, knew that the curriculum in all fields of study in the United States did not include African people. We were excluded except for caricatures and things like that. And so Dr. Asa Hilliard came up with the idea to have 6 baseline essays, which the teachers could infuse, take that content, the teachers could infuse into the curriculum. And so I was part of a very esteemed group of people to work on those essays. There was art, language arts, social science, history, music, and science. Dr. John Henry Clark wrote the essay for history. And I ended up writing the essay for science, African contributions to science, African American contributions to science and technology. And those essays, they had teacher workshops and things like that as to how to infuse it into the curriculum. And I think around 1989, the project went live, and it ended up having a profound effect on Black student achievement. Test scores were going up because students had more self-esteem, more positive self-esteem. Discipline problems dropped dramatically, and it was a success. And so other school districts in Atlanta, Detroit, found out about it, Oakland, California. And so there was this African-centered movement of education. This kind of complements independent Black institutions' efforts to do the same thing. But this was with the public schools and even Washington, D.C. In 1991, 92, as more and more people discovered the essays, of course, there were some people who weren't too happy with them. And so you find on the front page of the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, about a curricula of color, as it was called. But if you dug deep, you'll find in the stories that this curricula of color, at least for African American people, was making an impact. But then, the right-wing political wing in the country, because these essays didn't come through the filters of those in the educational establishment. And so there was a full frontal attack on the essays, and many of the school districts, because of a lot of other social and political factors, found that their funding was being cut because of state budgets. And gradually, over time, the African-centered education movement in the public schools declined and almost disappeared. It's kind of having a resurgence now. The Chicago Public Schools has what they developed, and I worked on that project with the superintendent at that time, Barbara Bird Bennett, and the DuSable Museum of African American History. And so they came up with something similar to the Portland essays, African American interdisciplinary curriculum. And so, there's been teacher trainings, but part of the problem with it has been most teachers are not aware of the curriculum, and most parents are not aware of the curriculum, and they can't access it because they don't know about it. So we know, this whole educational thrust got rebooted last year with the New York Times 1619 project, which was to reset the founding ideals of the United States instead of just looking at, the lofty rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence and other documents. it made the claim that really the founding has to consider the genocide that took place on the indigenous people of the lands, and what some would now call the humanicide that took place, not simply slavery, but the kidnapping of millions of Africans and holding them hostage, and social incarceration on plantations. And so that has created a huge controversy. In fact, now there's a lot of pushback on some of the claims, which weren't accurate, but not everything was inaccurate. And so the sister Hannah Jones, I believe, is getting it on both sides. She's being hit on the right with those who want to celebrate the founding of this country and look at the strength and the resilience that African people in America, African Americans, have survived it and want to celebrate that. And, that's cool. But then you have on the left Marxists who are condemning her and the project, saying that it's a grand falsification of history. I mean, and you don't have to take my word for it. You can go to the World Socialist website, right?
Hasn't Donald Trump allegedly created a, I don't know, a committee or something to this nature to be able to counter the 1619 project?
Right. On the right side. Exactly. So there he and his enablers and cohorts want to have a patriotic curriculum, as if what we learned wasn't supposed to instill a sense of patriotism in this country. I mean, because my dad fought in World War II. He got Purple Heart in the Italian theater. He was a medic. But even still, if you would come, he's not alive now, but if you saw his library, he was concerned about our history too. So, I mean, it was like my mother took me on marches, things like that, with Dr. King. So I have an activist side to my science side. And maybe that was because our family went to Salem Lutheran Church in Chicago, and anyone who has some bit of religious history, understanding of religious history, the whole reform movement of Christianity, the reform of the Catholic Church, was initiated by Martin Luther when he nailed those 99 edicts calling for reform of the Catholic Church. And so perhaps my rebelliousness comes from that historical incident. Well, maybe not.
Indeed, I appreciate it. Now, you mentioned that your father had a number of texts or a library, and your mother took you on marches. And I want to
see Paul Robeson. One of the last times he was here, my sister and I don't know if my brother went. So I was exposed to our culture, and I think it was in 2004, I got invited to the mayor of London's, that was Ken Livingstone at the time. He had something called the First Voice. In London, October is Black History Month. And so they had this conference. There was maybe 5,000 people at the Wembley Conference Center, not Wembley Stadium, but they're next to each other. And I had the distinct honor and privilege of meeting Paul Robeson Jr. And he's made his transition now, but it was a great moment because I kind of relived, even though I don't remember meeting his father, but that was a very interesting encounter, to say the least.
Yes, and I was getting to the importance of not only having those critical texts in the home, so that when a child gets of age, they can explore those things, but actively when they're young, getting them involved in the understanding of the world around them and politics, and in active engagement, and how that can shape the child, of course, when they become an adult, to be productive in the sense of working towards the liberation of African people. And that seems to be the case, in your home, at least growing up. I mean, and so I wanted to know, like, what type of text did he have in the home in terms of the library, in terms of wanting to know, like, what was he mainly concerned about in terms of the education, if you can remember those texts?
Oh, well, he had lots of things on books. I can't recall titles off the top of my head right at the moment, but many books on our history here in this country, on slavery, on the contradictions that the founders of this country had. And the same way with my mother. I mean, she has an original copy of Du Bois' book. Now I'm blanking on the title. 1908, when he had the essay of double consciousness. I'm blanking on the title, but so they had original copies of many of these things, of Langston Hughes' poems. My father was Mason, 33rd degree. My mother was in the Eastern Star. My father, as a child, would invite me to come to the garage sessions where he and his lodge brothers would talk about philosophy and the Bible, and gave me certainly a critical understanding of the Bible. Despite what I was getting in church, he would come and deconstruct, him and his lodge brothers, various verses. And, so, he, you know, exposed me to the whole way of being an independent thinker. That's what both of my parents did. Expose me and my sister and brother to independent thinking. And so that message was imparted to my three children. I have three children, a son who's a health insurance specialist. My oldest daughter is an elementary school teacher. In fact, she teaches at the same elementary school that I went to as a child. Then my youngest daughter is a cardiac thoracic surgeon in a hospital in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So I passed on to them that love for learning and discovering things for yourself, of being independent, but also loving yourself, respecting yourself, and loving who you are and your people. So that was our home environment.
I first came across your name many years ago. Of course, I'm many years younger than you, born in '79. But like around 98, 99, when I was in started undergrad, of course, well, I had come out of a Hebrew Israelite, religious paradigm, and started gravitating more towards, Afrocentricity and back to African consciousness.
Right.
So of course, you, at least on the college level, if you have an Africana Studies program, a good one at least, you're introduced to Cheikh Anta Diop. And, me coming into consciousness, I made the mistake of starting off with this book.
Yes.
The Civilization of Barbarism. And so he actually cites you when he's talking about the Dogon and the path of Dogon and Sirius B and all of this other kind of stuff. And so I was always heavy into science. I started off in accounting and then ended up into the software development and been on a computer science track ever since. But and so you mentioned earlier that this particular program is being recorded in September, but it's going to be released in October. And along with 3 other friends and colleagues, we started Black Science Month, a number of years ago, which is October, which we were going to premiere this in terms of the general public, this particular episode. And we want to encourage the African population, Black population, to really look into career fields in the various sciences. And we in part do this by appealing to their heritage and showing that African people have been involved in the sciences since the beginning of time, and that you shouldn't, if you do, consider the sciences and activity of Europeans. And so, as you stated in the beginning of our conversation, that your parents also, would get you, because you were interested, different science texts. And I want to, I want you to, inform us of what was it about the sciences that intrigued you so much that even though you didn't necessarily, get a PhD in physics, you were still engaged in the hard science conversations, and then how you mix that in with the narrative of African, history and culture and things of that nature. If I made any sense in my
It made perfect sense. Well, part of it was, I guess, early on was there was a chemist, nuclear chemist. His name was Dr. George Reed, right? And he was one of a number of African Americans who worked on the Manhattan Project, which was the development of the atomic bomb and also self-sustaining controlled nuclear reactors at University of Chicago. And he went to my church. And so I think I must have been 9 or 10. He took the Black kids, because the church I went to was maybe 80% Swedish and German, because the neighborhood that I grew up in was overwhelmingly white. And so the church was founded by Swedes and Germans. So we integrated the church, so to speak, because they wanted to show off to other white congregations that, oh, we have some good Black people here, kind of thing. Anyway, so he would take the Black children, members of the church, when Argonne National Laboratory had their open house. And so it's a huge, huge facility. Area-wise, it may be as large as some municipal airports. And so there were chemistry buildings, biology buildings, physics buildings, accelerator and stuff. And so he reinforced my own natural curiosity, because it's one thing when you're engaged with something in a sense of play, right? Even looking at Mr. Wizard on television. I don't even know if that still airs, but Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson in his Cosmos series, he kind of taken his place, which is cool with me. But it's another thing when you are actually in the environment, right? When you're immersed in the environment and you see people working, doing things. And I said, well, I want to work at that accelerator. 10 years later, I'm there at the accelerator, even though at that time I hadn't even completed my undergrad degree in 1970. But I was hired as a senior engineering technician because previous to that, I worked at the University of Chicago in the research chemistry department, operating something called a mass spectrometer, where one can identify the constituents of various chemical compounds by the mass of the elements that show up when you bombard them with some intense energy. Anyway, but I got fired from Argonne because I was too smart. I was helping graduate students find out how to better synthesize the compounds, to get their degrees. Anyway, so I ended up there, and it's, learning things about particle physics, being in that environment. And I end up working on something called particle beam detectors. It's something similar that we see at CERN in Europe, or at Fermilab, which was not too far away from where I worked, because you have to know exactly with extreme precision where these particles are as they circulate this ring, where they are in that space. And so you had to develop many different types of detectors that could inform the operators of where that beam was. Because if it has to strike a target, right, it has to be like pencil size, it really focused. And so they had these huge magnets, right? And the magnets would squish these particles, protons and other things, into a fine beam. And so that fine beam circulates, just like when you go to the hospital and you have an X-ray, right?
Yeah.
The X-ray is not like sunlight, just dispersed. It has to be focused to the specific area of the body in which it seeks to illuminate by scattering and things like that. So actually being in a science environment, to see people working there, doing things, that's what Dr. George Reed exposed me to. So it said, hey, this is a real possibility. And so I worked with STEM programs in the late 1980s and 90s. I was part of SECME. I think that's the Southeastern, I can't remember it now, to encourage our children, our students, to find an interest in science. Because if we can stimulate their curiosity, and if they can see themselves in the history of science invention, technology invention, then that might encourage them more, because they don't see themselves in the textbooks, right? When we take something as simple as making a pigment for a paint, we don't think too much of it now. Our shirts there's a dye that made our shirts red. But what if you could tell children that our people made dyes 30,000 years ago? Our people had knowledge of chemistry. And if when you go to Kemet or ancient Egypt today, and you go into those tombs, the paint is still there. It's still there. The vibrancy of the colors is still there. 3,000, 2,000 years later. Can we expect the paints that are being made at, the various companies? I'm not going to give out any names. I worked at a paint company making pigments, years ago, to support myself going to college and at that time. And we can do that. Why? Because we did it before. Our engineering skills, we see testimony to that when we look at whether it's the stone cities in Zimbabwe, right? Or the pyramids, or stones that were set up to be calendars in Kenya, in South Africa, and other places. We've done all of this. So it's not doing anything new. It's just recovering the impetus and the motivation that we can do it again. And we have been doing it. It's just most of us, we don't know. And so, people like you to start the Black Science Month is incredible, because we've been in all of that. We've done those things. We've charted the heavens. I mean, my music teacher, Phil Coran, who played with Sun Ra, who Maurice White of Earth, Wind, and Fire studied with. That's where that whole genre of music came from, was from him. He would tell me that most of the names for stars were African names. Later, those names got translated into Arabic. Few stars are named for any Europeans. Europeans didn't name stars. They didn't have names. They may have them now, but the oldest names were names that our people gave them. I mean, when you look at in South Africa, they have their own names for constellations and stars. The Zulu, the Sosha, they have their own name because it's a local environment. And so they're interpreting things from their geography. That's why geography and topography of the land is so important. So, different environments end up generating, right, different ways of seeing your relationship to that environment. And so that's something that our people have to understand, that one thing that Phil Coran told me that stuck with me in 1970 was that you can't know anything unless you study everything, right? And so today's educational system is intensely, extremely specialized. If you ask a biologist something about mechanical engineering, they won't have a clue. But the old way, you had to know something about everything. But of course, there were specialists, there were guilds, because those specialists could interpret reality from their perspective, but then it was shared. And so they had a common understanding. And so now today, there's two movements taking place in the sciences. The interdisciplinary movement, because now biologists see, I need to have a computational scientist to figure out how these proteins fold and unfold, right? To see how things move. And so you have a physicist who specialized in acoustic waves and said, maybe the nerve pulse is moving via sound rather than, or in addition to, electrical pulses. And so there's something called transdisciplinary research, which in a simple manner attempts to see the relationship between the various sciences, right? And so that allows people to imagine things from a different standpoint. And it's getting back to an African way of knowing.
I think
Because I'm sorry.
no, I was just about to say that that's one of the reasons why we honor and give deference to individuals like Cheikh Anta Diop, because of his multidisciplinary background and how he utilized that background in answering questions in terms of African history, in terms of using the rigors from his chemistry and physics background, along with his anthropology education and education in linguistics and history, and synthesizing those things to be able to answer questions of African history and politics. Using that information for political purposes, and we give him deference, and a lot of us have, followed in his footsteps in terms of, at least being conversant in these other disciplines, even if we have a specialization.
Right.
So I just wanted to say that, but I'm sorry, continue.
No, I mean, that's a very good point. And one of the things that Diop teaches us is that you may objectively observe some phenomenon, but who's going to pay for it, right? Here in the West, someone has to pay for the research. That means you may have to apply for a government grant. But there's people, and I worked on several National Science Foundation evaluation processes for giving grants in the sciences. And so that's where politics and values come into play, because someone has to ascribe value to your research. Someone has to say, oh, well, she knows so-and-so, right? She is a part of this department, and that department has a history of when they get grants, they end up doing something of value. And so we want to continue that by giving her the money because of the institution she's in. It brings value to, whatever it may be. So there's a politics and sociology to science. So, you might study whatever DNA, but, then someone may look at your work and say, oh, I can use that research to make a weapon. That's one of the things I like about the DC comic series, Black Lightning, right? I don't know if you're familiar with that or not.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Right. If you can set aside your disbelief for a lot of things in there, but there's a lot of science that's being presented to the viewer in that show, particularly on genetics and neuroscience, if one pays attention. And so we have to pay attention to what's called science fiction, because really it's coming out of someone's imagination. And so we can imagine things that don't exist right now. There's all types of possibilities. This isn't fixed. Science is always operating on a contingency, because Darwin said in his Origin of a Species, A, B, and C, but 100 years later, you see, oh, well, wasn't exactly right, because he didn't have the information that people have today. And so even the whole notion of evolution, his theory of evolution of life, is being revised today, right? That things aren't on a direct linear continuum. As you know, when you were in high school and looked at high school biology, and when you study human evolution, you saw, you starts off with the old world monkeys, then the new world monkeys, then the chimpanzees and bonobos, and finally, lastly, you see a white guy as a high stage of evolution, right?
Yeah.
That's false, totally false. But that was how we've been indoctrinated to see that we're not there, right? And Europeans still see themselves and amplified that, oh, we're the greatest thing that since sliced bread. And so you have to consider the politics of science and technology too. I mean, there's a whole thing now, as I'm sure you're aware of artificial intelligence and face recognition. Where someone makes the algorithms that decides what a person may be and how they might be criminalized. Someone is decided that. When they made the algorithm, they can make it so it can determine this person and exclude that person. And so we're seeing that. And so there's a whole notion of ethics involved in science and technology as well. And that's why something that Africans, one of our hallmarks is our sense of moral and ethical ideals. And, it comes under the rubric of a lot of different names. In Kemet, it was Ma'at. Among the Yoruba, it's Iwa Pele. So in South Africa, among the Zulu and Xhosa, it's Ubuntu. I am because we are because I am. That there's a continuity and fluidity to not just human relationships, but our relationships with everything that exists, even things that we don't see. We still have relationship with that. That's why Stevie Wonder can talk about today that we're out of tune, we're out of harmony with the rhythms of the universe, that there's been this massive disruption of everything because of the coronavirus. And there's a restructuring taking place. But the challenge is, as Killmonger said in the Black Panther, we got to restart the world. But we have to restart the world in a sense of reciprocity, of balance, of harmony, of justice. Yes, those are ideals, but if you don't have ideals, then how can human beings, Africans in particular, survive and even thrive?
Indeed. I want to bring in, we were on the Hoppy panel together.
Right.
Dealing with the film Hoppy, produced by our brother Taki.
Right.
Good brother Taki. And dealing with the economics, the role of economics in the formalization of civilization. And they wanted on that particular panel to kind of talk about the Dogon and why are they important in terms of the study of African history. And I want to re-ask that question, to you right now. Why are the Dogon, important for us to study in this day and age? And what do you get personally out of knowing what you know about the Dogon of Mali?
Well, the Dogon of Mali, currently of Mali, there's debate as to how they got to this area in Mali, maybe 100 miles or so from Timbuktu, the famed city Timbuktu. from the 13th, 14th century during the Mali Federation. I don't like to use the word empire, right? And so the Dogon, came to my attention from a book that I read called Conversations with Ogo, and he was a Dogon Hogon, translating it into English as a priest, but he was more than simply a priest. He was a village elder, someone to which the entire village looked up to. And, that book revealed a lot about how they see the world, their cosmology, their sense of ethics, their economy, and things like that. And so it was a great exposure to this unity of life, how they saw themselves as part of this fabric of life, that there was no separation, even from their adversaries, right? Even their adversaries were included in this grand schema of life. And I learned something about their astronomical knowledge, particularly of the Sirius star system. Sirius is the brightest star in the sky. You can always see it, this time in the southern hemisphere. And Sirius was important to the people of Kemet, which we know today as Egypt. Sirius was known as Subdet, if I'm pronouncing it fairly correctly. And so in Kemet, their whole yearly cycle would start off with the heliacal rising of Sirius. That is, the rise, heliacal simply means a star rises before the sun rises. So you can see it on the horizon before the sun rises. And you find that the Dogon, in a like manner, observed the same thing, the heliacal rising of Sirius. But then there's the controversy of their knowledge of Sirius, that there's another star orbiting Sirius. In today's parlance, it's called Sirius B, right? They called it Po Tolo, and Po just simply means Tolo. And they understood the star had an orbital period around Sirius A of 50 years. And, they saw that Jupiter, from their vantage point, they could see 4 moons of Jupiter. Of course, Jupiter has more than 4 moons, and they could see the rings of Saturn. So I said, this is absolutely fascinating. How could they see things without telescopes at their disposal? And so as I started to consider that, because I was someone who always wanted to figure things out, the why and the how. And so from studies of neuroscience, if you are in a dark environment, and when you go to rural places away from the big cities in Africa, I mean, I haven't been to Mali, but I've been to Ethiopia and other places. And when you're away from city lights, the blackness of the sky at night is profound. I'm sure you've had that experience. It's absolutely profound. And so if you are an astronomer and every day you're up when the sky, right at sunset, your eyes become extremely dark adapted over time. And sometimes if you are in a cave environment or an enclosed environment and you're not exposed to any light, your eyes become more sensitive to light, such that you can get a stimulus of 1 or 2 photons of light. And so, my hypothesis then was that from extremely dark adapted eyes, you can see objects around Jupiter. And, there's been experiments to support that. In the same way, you can see kind of a halo around the planet Saturn. Of course, we know there's many rings and many moons around Saturn too. But nonetheless, but that's discovered with telescope. But nonetheless, you can see that. And so this caused a lot of controversy. And this was in the book Le Renard Pale, or the Pale Fox, done by Marcel Grioli. And for the English translation, I was one of the people who contributed a back cover statement to that book, thanks to Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. And so when the scientific community, started looking at this, they were aghast. They were offended. How could these African people that we just know do these dances every 60 years, the Sigi dance every 60 years to honor the star, funeral dances. How could they know this? They have no business knowing this. And so you had some people like Robert Temple, who said that some beings from Sirius came down to Mali and they taught these people this information. Well, the Dogon has, like many Africans, a very complex epistemology, and epistemology is Greek for knowledge and knowing. How do you know, and what do you know? What's important for you to know? And so they had a number of levels in their epistemological system, from so, meaning word, the word at face value, all the way up to 8 levels to the astonishing word. Right? And so when they talk about the Nomo, or quote entities from Sirius, that largely is mythology that you tell children, fairy tales. Whether or not they actually were real beings or interdimensional beings, and we can't say for sure, because anyone who has taken ayahuasca, for example, or magic mushroom, psilocybin, in a high enough dosage, you may be exposed to ancestors, your own or others' ancestors, or some other entities. But that doesn't mean that even what you're exposed to is, it's another type of reality. And so when you have people like Robert Temple and others who interpret their work, they're interpreting it from a European perspective. And let's not forget that we got that, their knowledge from the time when Mali was a colony of France. And so the French had their colonial project across Africa at the time. They wanted to know, how can we extract more resources from Mali and other places, Senegal? How can we understand the people of Mali so we can influence them, so they can develop a love for France and less of a love for themselves, because we have to extract this. And so you have to learn the ways of people, but you're interpreting their knowledge for your benefit. And so even though Grioli sat with Dogon elders over a 25-year period, does not mean that they told him everything. Anyone who's been initiated into any African tradition, no matter where it is, they're not going to tell you everything. There's only some things that some people will tell you, and only under certain circumstances. You might have to learn something through participating in a ritual, because rituals were important for passing on knowledge, for passing on history. And so we don't know exactly what Rioli did. Only thing we have is the record of his conversations with those elders and his interpretation. So there's even a question of how much of what they told him is theirs, and how much of what they told him is a narrative that he constructed for his audience. And so whenever we're reading histories, anthropological literature, ethnographic literature in particular, we always have to consider the context and who is doing this work and what interests do they have, because it's not neutral. It may be true, but whose truth is it? Is it the Dogon's truth? If you go to Mali and you study with a Hogan or others, they're going to tell you things that they don't tell Europeans who happen to study with them, because everything is contextual and everything depends upon your level, right, as to what you are allowed to know. Because the Dogon really, their whole system was set up something like the classification system in intelligence agencies. There's secret, there's top secret, there's need to know secret, and some things only some people can know, only on a need to know basis, and you don't know everything.
Exactly.
So that's how their system was set up. So if one says, and many of our people believe, oh, well, these beings from Sirius came down and told them all this, these beings from another planet, planet of the gods, I won't even call the guy's name, that these aliens came down and did this, all kinds of shows on cable, alien history and things. All of those things are designed to repudiate the indigenous people, the indigenous Africans.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I wish we can go on longer, but our time is pretty much up here, which only means that we have to invite you back so that we can continue the conversation. And I just wanted to ask you this one question before we go, and that is, are you currently working on anything? And if so, what is it, and when do you expect it to be released in terms of scholarship or whatever?
Currently, I'm completing a book. It'll be out next year, called We Were Never Slaves. And this book takes issue with the whole notion of language, and I'm sure you can appreciate that we should never refer to our ancestors as slaves. Slave is a word that means Slavic people, Slav, Eastern Europeans. We're not Eastern Europeans, and we should not have as a badge of description a term that is used to dehumanize us as a people. And so I have a whole series of arguments as to why we should not refer to ourselves as slaves, why what we experienced was not slavery. Is something that I call crimes against life, or another person who worked on the Genocide Convention called, quote, slavery and colonialism, humanicide. So We Were Never Slaves will be out in the spring of next year. And for your listeners, we will be doing part 2 of African Sacred Science with Professor James Smalls and Dr. Wade Nobles, October the 9th. And I can give you the information, a link that you can add on, to your websites for that. So those are my current projects.
All righty. Well, I appreciate it greatly. You coming on and sharing your wisdom and insights. Again, we have to invite you back and continue the conversation, and we have a more narrow conversation on a particular topic. But it is a blessing to have you on. It's an honor and a privilege, and I appreciate it greatly. And if the people wanted to, I don't know if you're a social media type person, but if people wanted to ask you and get in contact with you to keep up and, get a more definitive date of when your books are coming out and just what you're dealing with, or they may have questions. They
can find me on Facebook, and I'm on Twitter.
Okay.
All they got to do is search for me on Facebook. You'll see a picture of me. I mean, there may be other Hunter Adams are out there, but you'll see a picture of me with Danny Glover.
All
and
right.
so that's how they'll know it's me.
Indeed.
So I'll be happy to, share with whatever. I mean, I do post a lot of things on a lot of different subjects. So check me out on Facebook or Twitter.
Appreciate it. I appreciate it. And so with that said, family, I will see you next time. And my credentials, of course, if you want to get in contact with me, you want to support the channel, or you want to support the upcoming film, you can reach me on my website at asarimhotep.com, as well as these social media platforms. So with that said, y'all have a blessed week, and I will see you next time. Peace.